On March 13, 2013, Jorge Bergoglio from Argentina was elected anti-Pope Francis of the Vatican II sect. This brief overview will prove from Francis's words and actions that he is a heretic. We will be quoting from the Vatican's official newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, and two of Francis's books that document his beliefs on various topics: Conversations with Jorge Bergoglio and On Heaven and Earth. Francis's heresies on the Jews. Jews reject that Jesus Christ is God, but Jesus Christ says in John 8:24, quote, "For if you believe not that I am He, you shall die in your sin." The Catholic Church infallibly teaches that you must believe in Jesus Christ and have the Catholic faith for salvation. It teaches that it's a mortal sin to observe or practice Judaism, but Francis endorses the false religion of Judaism and prays in Jewish synagogues. Francis, Conversations with Jorge Bergoglio, page 208, quote, "Not long ago I was in a synagogue taking part in a ceremony. I prayed a lot, and while praying I heard a phrase from one of the books of wisdom that had slipped my mind. Lord, may I bear mockery in silence. It gave me much peace and joy." Francis, On Heaven and Earth, page 188, quote, "The Church officially recognizes that the people of Israel continue to be the chosen people. Nowhere does it say you lost the game. Now it is our turn. It is a recognition of the people of Israel." This clearly means that Francis holds that people who reject Jesus Christ are the chosen people in God's sight. This is a blasphemy against God. Francis, On Heaven and Earth, page 37, quote, "There also exists the ministerial intercession of a rabbi or a priest who prays or asks for the health of another, and it is granted. What gives credibility to a person who is healing according to the law of God is simplicity, humility, and the absence of a spectacle." So Francis believes that Jewish rabbis have a true spiritual ministry of intercession according to the law of God. Francis, On Heaven and Earth, page 220. Francis speaks to the Jewish rabbi Skorka, quote, "I did not forget how you invited me twice to pray and to speak in the synagogue, and I invited you to speak to my seminarians about values," end quote. In the cathedral in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on April 15, 1998, Francis held an interreligious service to honor deceased Jews. During this meeting, Francis said to the Jews, quote, "We are all brothers because we have the seal of God in our hearts. The seal of God is baptism, which Jews reject.
Que sabe que todos somos hermanos porque llevamos el sello de Dios en nuestro corazón."
In September 2004, Francis participated in a Jewish service inside a synagogue. And on November 9, 2005, Francis had another service inside a basilica commemorating deceased Jews. This included Francis lighting a candle in honor of them. In 2007, Francis attended Jewish Rosh Hashanah services at a synagogue in Argentina. Francis told the Jewish congregation during his visit that he went to the synagogue to examine his heart, quote, "like a pilgrim together with you, my elder brothers," end quote. On July 7, 2008, Francis endorsed Rabbi Sergio Bergman's books. Francis called him a, quote, "believer," and said, quote, "his job is the one of a rabbi who, as our master, helps us," end quote.
Su trabajo es el de un rabino que como maestro nos ayuda a entendernos.
On June 7, 2010, Francis visited the Jewish Center in Argentina and called Jews, quote, "our elder brothers," and, quote, "the chosen people of God." He also prayed in front of a list of deceased Jews in order to honor them.
Ese recuerdo, ¿verdad? Es un eslabón más en la cadena de dolor, persecución, sangre que el pueblo elegido de Dios ha sufrido en la historia. Doy gracias al Señor porque en este día le permite compartir un trecho del camino con sus hermanos mayores.
On October 11, 2012, Francis gave Rabbi Abraham Skorka, who is a well-known supporter of homosexuality, an honorary degree at a, quote, Catholic university. After the rabbi received the degree, he said, quote, "We are waiting for the Messiah, but in order for him to come, we have to prepare the land," end quote.
Estamos esperando el Mesías, pero para que él llegue, le tenemos que preparar el terreno.
So the rabbi explicitly rejected the Messiah, Jesus Christ, right in front of Francis. On November 12, 2012, Francis was the keynote speaker and took active part in another Jewish religious ceremony in the cathedral in Buenos Aires, Argentina. This Jewish religious ceremony was again dedicated to honor deceased Jews. The final candle commemorating deceased Jews was jointly lit by a rabbi and Francis. Under Francis's direction, memorial services honoring deceased Jews have been celebrated in so-called Catholic churches in Argentina every year since 1998. To take part in a Jewish religious ceremony for deceased Jews is complete apostasy from the Catholic faith. On December 14, 2012, just a few months before his election as antipope, Francis celebrated Hanukkah with Jews in Argentina, which included Francis lighting a menorah. On March 13, 2013, just a few hours after Francis was elected antipope, he sent out a greeting letter to the Christ-rejecting chief rabbi of Rome. On March 25, 2013, Francis sent a telegram to Rome's chief rabbi for Passover. Francis said that he esteems Jews and asked them to pray for him. He also asked that God, quote, continue to deliver you from all evil, even though the rabbi rejects Jesus, the only one who can deliver us from evil. In his June 24, 2013 address to members of the International Jewish Committee, Francis called Jews believers and asked Jews to pray for him. Francis's heresies on Islam. On August 2, 2005, Francis prayed before the dead body of the Muslim president of the Islamic Center of Argentina. The body was placed east toward Mecca. The Islamic imam recited verses from the Koran and asked for blessings from Muhammad. Francis said, quote, with my prayer I ask the Creator, the most merciful, to repay him for all the good he did, end quote. St. Thomas Aquinas taught, quote, if anyone were to worship at the tomb of Muhammad, he would be deemed an apostate. Francis's action of venerating the dead body of a Muslim leader is equivalent to worshiping at the tomb of Muhammad. On June 29, 2010, Francis visited an Islamic center and said, quote, I came as a brother to strengthen ties, end quote. In his homily of July 8, 2013, Francis spoke to Muslims saying, quote, I also think with affection of those Muslim immigrants who this evening begin the fast of Ramadan, which I trust will bear abundant spiritual fruit.
Un pensiero lo rivolgo ai cari immigrati musulmani che oggi alla sera stanno iniziando il digiuno di Ramadan con l'augurio di abbondanti frutti spirituali.
Francis's heresies on other false religions. In On Heaven and Earth, page 236, Francis wrote about new religious belief systems and movements. He stated, quote, I am respectful of all new spiritual proposals. Surviving the passage of time is the major test of spiritual purity. So according to the apostate Francis, the false religion of Hinduism is a true and pure spirituality because it has been around for 3,000 years and has survived the passage of time. Francis addressed May 18, 2013, quote, promote religious freedom for everyone. Every man and every woman must be free in his or her profession of religion, whatever it may be, end quote. The Catholic Church condemns the idea that religious freedom should be a universal civil right. After the September 11, 2001 attacks in America, Francis participated in a prayer meeting with leaders of other false religions at the foot of an obelisk in Argentina. The obelisk is a Masonic phallic symbol. In his January 6, 1928 encyclical Mortalium Animos, Pope Pius XI condemned Catholic participation in interreligious prayer meetings as apostasy. He taught that those who favor this activity have abandoned the Catholic religion. He also said, quote, so, venerable brethren, it is clear why this apostolic see has never allowed its subjects to take part in the assemblies of non-Catholics, end quote. But as we have already seen, Francis has been involved in numerous interreligious prayer meetings. On January 24, 2002, Francis invited many different leaders of false religions to pray in the cathedral in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The meeting included leaders from Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. Francis's announcement during the meeting was that, quote, every religious group will pray according to their faith, language, and tradition, in full respect for others, end quote. This is apostasy. On May 5, 2006, Francis prayed with members of the Universal Parliament of Religions and in 2011 Francis held his own interreligious prayer meeting. On March 20, 2013, Francis had a meeting with leaders of different religions which included schismatics, Jews, and Muslims. Francis said, quote, "Yesterday morning during Holy Mass, through you I felt the spiritual presence of the communities which you represent," end quote. He went on to say that he esteems them. As we have just shown, Francis completely rejects the infallible teaching of the Catholic Church that members of false religions need to accept the Catholic faith for salvation. Pope Eugene IV, Council of Florence, 1439, ex cathedra, quote, "Whoever wishes to be saved needs above all to hold the Catholic faith. Unless each one preserves this whole and inviolate, he will without a doubt perish in eternity." Francis respects atheists. In On Heaven and Earth, pages 12 and 13, Francis says he respects atheists and doesn't try to convert them. Quote, "I do not approach the relationship in order to proselytize or convert the atheist. I respect him, nor would I say that his life is condemned, because I am convinced that I do not have the right to make a judgment about the honesty of that person. Every man is the image of God, whether he is a believer or not. For that reason alone, everyone has a series of virtues, qualities, and a greatness of his own." Francis respects those who commit suicide. Francis on Heaven and Earth, pages 92 and 93, quote, "There was a time when they did not perform funerals for those that committed suicide because they had not continued on towards the goal. They ended the path when they wanted to. But I still respect the one who commits suicide. He is a person who could not overcome the contradictions in his life. I do not reject him," end quote. Francis's teaching on man. Francis, Conversations, page 220, quote, "For me, hope is in the human person. I believe in man. I'm not saying man is good or bad, just that I believe in man." Francis's heretical teaching on sin. Francis, Conversations, pages 120 and 121, quote, "I often say that the only glory we have, as St. Paul says, is that of being sinners. St. Paul doesn't say this. This is outrageous." Francis then goes on to say on the next page, quote, "That's why, for me, sin is not a stain I need to clean," end quote. Francis, Conversations, page 129, quote, "It is a problem of sin. For 4 years, Argentina has been living a sinful existence because it has not taken responsibility for those who have no food or work," end quote. Notice that the only sin Francis speaks of is not giving people food or work. He says nothing about sins against God and God's faith. Francis on communism. Francis on Heaven and Earth, page 131, quote, "I remember that in high school there was a communist professor. We had a wonderful relationship with him. He questioned us about everything and it was good for us, but he never lied to us," end quote. Francis, Conversations, page 39, quote, "It's true that I was, like the rest of my family, a practicing Catholic, but my mind was not made solely for religious questions. I read Our Word and Proposals, a publication by the Communist Party, and I loved every article ever written by Leonidas Barletta, one of their best-known members," end quote. Francis on the death penalty. Francis, Conversations, page 101, quote, "There is now an increasing awareness of the immorality of the death penalty," end quote. This statement is completely heretical. The Catholic Church has always supported the legitimacy of the death penalty for extremely grave crimes. Francis promotes sex education. Francis, Conversations, page 111, quote, "The Church is not opposed to sex education. Personally, I believe that it ought to be available throughout children's upbringing, adapted to different age groups. In truth, the Church always provided sex education, although I acknowledge that it hasn't always been adequate," end quote. Pope Pius XI, December 31st, 1931, quote, "For here and there a great many foolishly and dangerously hold in advance the method of education which is disgustingly called sexual," end quote. Francis encourages priests to leave the priesthood if they fall in love. Francis, Conversations, pages 118 and 119, quote, "There are times when a priest does fall in love and must reassess his vocation and his life. Then he must go to the bishop and tell him, quote, 'I've made up my mind. I didn't know I was going to feel something so beautiful. I truly love this woman.' And he asks to leave the priesthood. And what do you do in these cases? Francis, I stay with him. I accompany him on his spiritual journey. If he is sure of his decision, I even help him find work. We request what is called dispensation, permission from Rome, and then he would be allowed to receive the sacrament of marriage," end quote. So Francis will help a man who has taken a permanent vow of chastity before God to break his vow and leave the priesthood. Francis's heretical teaching on gay marriage and homosexuality. It has now been documented and confirmed that Francis favored homosexual civil unions when he was in Argentina. He just didn't want a homosexual civil union to be called a marriage. This is heresy. It means that Francis approved perverted and abominable sexual behavior that is condemned in Scripture and Catholic teaching. His stance is no different at all from endorsing abortion under the condition that the state does not give abortion special or privileged status by using state funds for it. Notice the following interesting statements Francis makes about gay marriage and homosexuals. Francis on Heaven and Earth, page 117, quote, "When the head of the government of the city of Buenos Aires, Mauricio Macri, did not appeal the judge's opinion right away authorizing a same-sex wedding, I felt that I had something to say, to inform. I saw myself with an obligation to state my opinion. It was the first time in 18 years as bishop that I criticized a government official. If you analyze the two declarations that I formulated, at no time did I speak about homosexuals, nor did I make any derogatory reference toward them. Macri told me that these were his convictions. I respected him for that, but the head of the government does not have to transfer his personal convictions to law. In no moment did I speak disrespectfully about homosexuals," end quote. Francis says he respects those who favor the abomination of same-sex marriage, and he says he never was disrespectful to sodomites and perverts. Francis also mentions how he allowed the pro-gay marriage president of Argentina, Nestor Kirchner, to preside over a Catholic memorial service to honor deceased Catholic priests and seminarians. Francis, Conversations, page 145, quote, "I even asked him to preside over the ceremony when he arrived at the church," end quote. Later, when the apostate president died, Francis immediately offered a public requiem mass for him. Francis also allowed politicians who are vocal abortion and gay marriage supporters to receive communion at his installation mass. Francis's heretical teaching on heretics and schismatics. Francis on Heaven and Earth, page 128, quote, "I also do not agree with religion classes that entail discrimination against non-Catholics," end quote. In Argentina, Francis would recommend, Catholics seeking an exorcism to a Lutheran exorcist. In On Heaven and Earth, page 72, Francis quotes what his grandmother told him when he was younger, quote, "They are Protestants, but they are good. That was the wisdom of the true religion." In 2006, Francis knelt to receive a blessing from Protestants during an ecumenical meeting. Francis did the same thing immediately after being elected anti-pope on 3/13/13. Francis, instead of blessing the people, asked the people to bless him. This included numerous members of various non-Catholic religions. On March 18, 2013, Francis wrote to the new leader of the Anglican sect. He called the layman Justin Welby, quote, "Reverend." Even though the Catholic Church under Leo XIII reaffirmed on September 13, 1896 that the Anglican rite of ordination is totally invalid, Francis said that Welby has a, quote, "pastoral ministry," and he called him, quote, "Archbishop of Canterbury," which means he believes that the leader of the heretical and schismatic Anglican sect is the true jurisdictional leader of the one true church for Canterbury, England. He also asked the heretical and schismatic leader to pray for him. In his June 14, 2013 address to the schismatic Welby, Francis welcomes him, quote, "not as a guest or a stranger, but as a fellow citizen of the saints and the family of God," end quote. Francis thus emphatically teaches that the non-Catholic Welby, whom Francis calls, quote, "your grace," is a member of the Church of Christ. This is outrageous heresy. Francis then says he is, quote, "deeply grateful that the heretical and schismatic layman prayed for him." Francis goes on to say that he has profound respect for Anglicans and that there is now a better appreciation for Anglican spiritual and so-called liturgical traditions. As it is taught in Vatican II, Francis holds that Protestants and the quote Orthodox are in the Church of Christ and that they don't need to be converted to the Catholic faith for salvation. That is heresy. Francis, May 10, 2013, greeting to schismatic quote Orthodox Pope of Alexandria, Egypt, quote, "Your Holiness, in sincerely assuring you of my prayers that the whole flock entrusted to your pastoral care may be ever faithful to the Lord's call, I invoke the protection of both St. Peter and St. Mark, end quote. Francis calls the schismatic, quote, holiness, and says God entrusts his flock to a schismatic. He also calls him a pastor, which means he believes the schismatic leader is a true jurisdictional leader of the one true Church of Christ. In On Heaven and Earth, pages 217 and 218, Francis recommends that different denominations, quote, walk together in a reconciled diversity by doing things together, by praying together, without nullifying the diverse traditions. Here, Francis promotes the heresy that we should not try to convert non-Catholics, but walk and pray together with them without nullifying their diverse heretical and schismatic traditions. Pope Pius XI, Mortali Manimos, quote, for the union of Christians can only be promoted by promoting the return to the one true Church of Christ of those who are separated from it, end quote. Francis, the liturgical revolutionary. Here is Francis celebrating a modernist kiddie, quote, mass with female liturgical dancing. Francis on Heaven and Earth, page 102, quote, in Catholicism, for example, many women lead a liturgy of the word. Francis has, of course, given, quote, communion in the hand throughout his life. Francis has never offered a valid Mass, not just because he offers the invalid new Mass, but also because he was, quote, ordained on 12/13/69 in the new invalid rite of ordination. Francis, like his predecessor Benedict XVI, was, quote, consecrated a bishop in the new invalid rite of consecration. A true pope is the Bishop of Rome. Francis is not a bishop. That's another reason he is not the pope. Freemasons endorse Francis. Francis was recently praised by the Grand Masters of the Grand Orient Lodges of Italy and Argentina. They publicly supported Francis's election as the new anti-pope. In this picture taken of Francis, we can see him giving what looks to be the sign of the master of the second veil in Freemasonry. This is a clear hand gesture given by Freemasons throughout history. It would be no surprise to find out that Francis is a Freemason, because his beliefs, which have been manifested by his words and deeds, are indeed Masonic. The main teaching of Freemasonry is that all religions lead to God. As we have clearly proven in this brief overview of Francis, this is exactly what he believes. In short, Francis firmly believes and teaches the same heresies that have been promoted by the other Vatican II antipopes. Francis is a total heretic and an apostate. Catholic dogma defines that a heretic is not a member of the Catholic Church. It is therefore infallible that Francis is not a valid pope, but a heretical, non-Catholic antipope.